With Preston being here again, we wanted to have him talk on the idea that we hear a little about the benefits that can come from UFO encounters. With that small introduction, because I know Preston will start talking about his book, he's got a beautiful set of drawings and images that will take you into what he wants to talk about. So right now, please just help me welcome Preston Dennett.
Thank you, guys. Here I'm going to start by sharing screen. All right. First of all, I want to say thank you, Marianne, Alan, and everyone here who has come to hear me speak. I really appreciate it. I think this is a very important subject. I got involved in UFO research in 1986. I was quite a young man, 21 years old, when I found out that my family, friends, and coworkers were having UFO encounters. And it was quite a shock to me, finding out UFOs were real. And I initially wasn't happy about it. It sounded quite scary to me. But as I began to do research, I started realizing that a lot of the really wonderful aspects of UFO contact were not getting the attention they deserved. In fact, one of my earliest cases involved a lady who was healed of a cyst during her contacts. And I decided I would write an article about UFO healing cases because I knew of several others in the literature. I thought this would make an interesting study. And I found more than 30 cases very quickly, realized this was far too much information for a little article, and ended up doing a full-length book on it. So this is how I kind of got involved into the study of the UFO healing aspect, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's see here. This was actually the first article I wrote about UFOs for the local newspaper where I lived. I was shocked when the editor gave it the cover. And this is when I had a lot of people start coming to me, sharing their UFO stories. And here are all the UFO books I've written up to today. These are just the ones on UFOs. I have written on a number of other paranormal subjects because there is a relation to ghosts, out-of-body experiences, psychic abilities, Bigfoot even, levitation. But UFOs has really been my passion, and that's what I've devoted a lot of my energies and time to. And this was the first book that I wrote, which was published in 1996, and it covered 100 cases of people who were healed as a result of a UFO encounter. It was the first book ever to cover this subject, and it went out of print after about 10 years. And honestly, every time I spoke on this subject, whether it was at a convention or a UFO group or on the radio or at a bookstore, pretty much every single time someone would come up to me from the audience and share their story. And it became clear to me that I would have to do a sequel on this to really get all the information out there. I did do a lot of work publicizing these cases because I felt they were really important. There's an enormous amount of fear surrounding this subject. I don't think it's really warranted. Overall, I think the UFO contact experience is actually quite positive. And I have talked to people who have had trauma or scary contacts or negative experiences, but I would say about 80%, 90% are really quite positive. And I'm not the only researcher saying this. Following the publication of my book, UFO Healings, Virginia Aronson, pictured here, wrote her book, Celestial Healings, which sort of took off where my book left off. And she covered a bunch of other cases of people who have been healed. And other researchers sort of started to realize that the contact experience can be quite benevolent. And there were a number of them who really started to research this. So I'm really proud of that I was able to get some more attention paid to these positive cases. Here is Dr. Adrian Davies, who wrote a book, Healing Entities and Aliens. in which he described how many contactees learn how to become healers themselves. And he's got many, many testimonials of this. So this is how it all sort of evolved for me. Recently, I think this is just about 2 years ago, 1.5 years, I put this book out because I had since collected 3 times the number of cases from back in 1996. I've now documented more than 300 instances of healing as a result of a UFO encounter. And these are physical healings. There are, some psychological healings in many, many different ways. ETs do help people, which I will get into. But specifically here, I'm talking about positive physiological effects as a result of a close encounter. And there are an enormous number of cases. And the 300 I'm able to document here, I honestly think are just the tip of the iceberg, because only about 1 in 100 people will report their encounter in any official capacity. So you could easily times this by 100. And I think a lot of these cases do go unreported. I'm still getting many to this day. The first UFO researcher to ever really take these cases seriously was Gordon Creighton, who was the editor of the Flying Saucer Review in the UK. And he wrote an article back in the 1970s, actually 1970 exactly, called Healing from UFOs, in which he outlined some 10 cases and urged researchers to take these cases seriously, because to overlook them would be to ignore one of the most positive aspects of a UFO encounter. So he was really the first. There were many others. Bud Hopkins, pictured here, is arguably one of the leading UFO researchers in the US until his passing. And he put out about 6 books on this subject and never once mentioned UFO healings. And I was curious about that because I have come to believe that this is a consistent feature of UFO contact. And I actually asked him, I was able to talk to him face to face, and I asked him if he ever gets UFO healing cases. And he said, yes, we do. I have quite a few of them. I'm not sure what to make of them because some people are healed and others aren't. But he says, I'm very much encouraged by them. I think it shows a very positive aspect of UFO contact, and that ETs themselves are really interested in what he said are the most lovely aspects of being human. So he took a somewhat positive outlook at this. And as I began to survey other researchers, I found that nearly every single one of them, I'm not going to say everyone, but pretty much all major researchers have multiple cases of UFO healings, but weren't talking about them because this is sort of the fringe of the fringe. It's hard enough talking about UFOs, but talking about people who've been healed by UFOs was something a lot of researchers weren't quite willing to do at this time. Here's another leading researcher, Dr. David Jacobs, who takes a somewhat negative viewpoint towards UFO contact, but does admit that he has many, many healing cases. People healed of pneumonia, of diphtheria, of a wide variety of illnesses. So he absolutely does have UFO healing cases, as do most researchers. Here's Dr. John Mack, who wrote a book, Abduction. He's actually won the Pulitzer Prize for his previous works and was one of the first academics to really stick his neck out and talk about the UFO subject. And he had many, many cases of people who were healed as a result of UFO contact. Dr. Edith Fiore, PhD, pictured here, was the first person with a PhD to write a book about UFO contact. And in her files, she said that fully 50%, half of her clients had reported UFO healing cases. Some researchers thought it was quite rare. Others, like Edith Fiore, said she feels it's actually very common. In my own files, it's about 25%, but it's far more common, I think, than people realize. Barbara Lamb, one of my favorite researchers, has many, many cases. People healed of heart disease, of chronic back pain, of infertility, many other cases. Brad Steiger, a leading UFO researcher, has contributed at least a dozen cases of people who were healed. This is Yvonne Smith, leading Southern California researcher. She had a case of a gentleman who was apparently cured of AIDS. He was diagnosed with AIDS, had an encounter, was later tested, and they could not find any trace of his disease. This is Major Wendell Stevens, retired from the Air Force. He had quite a few cases. So the point is, this is a consistent feature of UFO contact. Richard and Lee K. Boyland wrote one of the first books that took a positive viewpoint towards the UFO experience. And he has many cases. I wrote to him personally, and he confirmed several cases. So there are dozens upon dozens of researchers: Tim Beckley, Joseph Burks, Constance Clear, Timothy Good, an English researcher, Anne Druffel, Cynthia Hind, a researcher from Africa, Jim and Coral Lorenzen from Arizona. Many, many researchers have these types of cases. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why I think ETs are good doctors. If you look at what happens to a person who is taken on board a UFO, the single most common experience people report is being physically examined. ETs are very interested in the human body, and this is the most common experience people report. And in fact, they will describe the interior of a UFO as looking very much like a doctor's office. There's an examination table. Often they will call the ETs themselves doctors, and they have hair samples taken, blood samples. They're given a basic checkup. And this can be a very scary experience for people, particularly because the appearance of the ETs is so different. But really, all they're doing is a physical checkup, much as we would see in a doctor's office. And in fact, Travis Walton, who is probably the most famous abductee in the United States, who was struck by a beam of light from a UFO in 1974 in Snowflake, Arizona, was taken on board. And when he woke up, he thought he was actually in a hospital. And it wasn't until he saw the appearance of these figures around him that he realized he wasn't, and that he was inside of a UFO. But he does believe they actually saved his life. And many contactees have told me that when they first went inside a UFO, they thought it was a hospital. So I've come to almost look at UFOs as floating hospitals. This is a primary ET agenda, healing humans. I'm very confident in saying that just because of the huge number of cases coming from researchers all across the world. And these healings are done in many different ways. Usually it takes the form of light, perhaps a beam of light from a UFO, sometimes from a handheld instrument, but light is the primary method that ETs are using to heal people. It's certainly not the only method. Some people are given pills or salves and lotions. Some people are given liquids to drink. In fact, in some cases, people report that there are no instruments used and that the ETs are basically doing what amounts to a hands-on healing, very much like Reiki or psychic healing. But the point is that healing takes many different forms. Some people are given a traditional operation, much as we would see in a conventional hospital. I want to talk a little bit about medical evidence before I get to the actual healing cases. Just real quick, many people report physiological effects as a result of a UFO encounter, particularly if they're taken on board. Pictured here are various scoop marks and scars that people receive following a UFO encounter or during. And I think I would liken this to sort of a vaccination mark that people get on their bodies, because that's what we often see. Some people do feel they're being implanted. And for many years, people thought the purpose of implants was to track people. That turns out not to be true. The firsthand information coming directly from contactees who actually asked these ETs what was the purpose of the implant was told that it was to measure the level of pollution in your body, boost your immune system, monitor your vital signs, maintain your health. There's some good evidence pointing towards that being the reason for these alleged alien implants. But medical evidence is very important. It can make or break a case. Here's a gentleman I interviewed who actually discovered he was a contactee after waking up in the morning and finding these triangular marks, puncture wounds, needle marks, bruises on his body. These are indications that you have had a physical examination or a procedure at the hands of ETs. Not everyone remembers this. Some of this can be shrouded in amnesia, but there are definitely clues that this has taken place. And this is an MRI from Mike Evans, who shows an implant in his brain. And this is something that's quite commonly reported among abductees, some sort of implant. And as I said, I've come to the conclusion that these implants are actually very positive things. There are people who have been injured as a result of a UFO encounter. Often this takes the form of some form of radiation sickness. Pictured here are Elaine Thomas, Louise Smith, and Mona Stafford, who had an experience in Kentucky in 1976. And following their encounter, they suffered severe eye irritation, burns, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, and weight loss. This appears to mimic or be parallel the symptoms from exposure to radiation. And there are a number of cases like this. And this is really good evidence of the reality of UFOs, but it shows that on occasion, it can be harmful to get too close to a UFO because they do emit radiation. And some people do have these types of encounters. Here's a picture of Denise Bishop from England, who was outside her home. She saw a metallic disc high overhead. It sent down a beam of light, which struck her hand. She was temporarily unable to move. This beam retracted and the UFO darted off, and her hand started to hurt. And over the next few days, a burn started to develop and get worse to the point where she did go to the doctor. The doctor was shocked because this looked like a laser burn, not your typical burn from perhaps an iron or a pot on the stove or what have you. So it was a quite curious burn. And he said it looked to him like it had come from a laser, and asked her, was she exposed to any laser beams? And she said no, and told him what happened. So again, this is really good evidence. And in fact, the MUFON UFO handbook, the investigator's handbook, has a section marked physiological effects from UFOs, but only mentions injuries and completely overlooks the fact that many, many people are having healings. What I found is that the injury cases appear to be largely, perhaps not always, but largely accidental, whereas the healing cases seem quite intentional in most cases. Here's another example of a gentleman who got too close to a landed UFO. It took off and he suffered some pretty severe symptoms as a result of getting too close to this UFO. This occurred on May 20th, 1967 in Canada. And the gentleman, Stefan Michalik, suffered burns on his chest. Following this, he had fainting spells, weight loss, headaches, diarrhea. His joints swelled up. He had eye irritation. He ended up losing 22 pounds, and his blood lymphocyte level went down from 25 to 16%. So it was quite severe symptoms. He was examined by 27 separate doctors who could not account for his symptoms other than to be some form of radiation sickness. So I just wanted to touch on the medical injury cases to let you know that these do happen, but I'm much more interested in the healing cases, and I actually think they're far more numerous. And these healing cases can take place in a number of different ways. As I mentioned, there's various methods of healing, but many of these cases, about 22%, take place in a person's home, particularly their bedroom. ETs will just show up and essentially do a house call and heal a person in their own room. Most cases, about 49 to 50%, take place on board a UFO, particularly if it's a severe illness that needs an operation. Pretty much all the cases of people who are healed of cancer, and there are some 40 of them that I was able to find, very well documented, have taken place on board a UFO. So the more severe the illness, the more likely it's going to take place inside an actual craft. Many cases, about 20% or so, take place while a person is walking outside or perhaps driving their car. A UFO will hover over them. Sometimes it just circles the car or circles around them. Sometimes it will send down a beam of light, but many cases do take place when a person is outside. And this next category I found quite shocking and unexpected. At least 10 to 12% of these cases take place inside a hospital. And I know how this must sound to someone who's skeptical of this subject, but if you study it for any length of time, you will see that ETs appear everywhere. I have cases of people who have seen ETs in hotel rooms, in crowded condominium complexes, in public, and about 10% of the cases I found took place inside a hospital room. Pictured here is the Cowichan Hospital in Canada, when a nurse by the name of Doreen Kendall, who was inside the children's ward, saw this UFO hovering right outside the children's ward, showing an obvious interest in the people inside. So again, I think healing is one of their main agendas, and that's why we have so many of these cases of UFOs hovering over hospitals or people who are being prepared for surgery and will have ETs appear in their actual hospital room. So now let's get into the healing cases. A very famous case took place on September 3rd, 1965 in Damon, Texas, to two police officers. Deputies Robert Good and McCoy were in Damon, Texas, driving by this field here pictured on your lower right when they saw this very large object pictured on top. These are drawings from the police officers. And as they drove by this object, they slowed down to look at it. It sent down a beam of light, which played across the field and then struck their police cruiser. Well, it turned out that Deputy Good had his arm hanging outside the window, and he was struck by this beam of light. He could feel it. He said it was warm and tingling, and they were quite frightened, and they sped away at high speeds and pulled into a diner. Prior to this experience, Deputy Good had been bitten by his son's baby pet alligator on his finger, and it left a pretty serious wound. It was inflamed, swollen, quite painful, and bandaged up. Following this experience, as they pulled into the diner and sat down, he noticed his finger was no longer painful. So he pulled off the bandage and the cut was gone. Whatever this beam of light had done, it cured his flesh wound instantly. This is one of the most common types of reported healings, and it's done very much like we would see in Star Trek. Whatever these lights are doing, they are healing flesh wounds very quickly. This is a very well authenticated case. I will say that Deputy McCoy was a supervisor and had some 50 police officers who served under him, and they were interviewed by a Major Leach from a nearby Air Force base. This is a very famous case. It's appeared in more than a dozen UFO books and is very well authenticated. But it's certainly not the only one. There are so many cases. There's just no way I'm going to be able to get through all of them. I'm just going to touch on some of the more interesting ones. Here's a case that comes from Jacques Vallée, a professional astronomer, one of the first scientists to look into the UFO phenomena. He interviewed a medical doctor from France who woke up one evening because there were flashes of light coming from his infant son's bedroom. He rushed into the room and saw two discs, flying saucers, hovering outside his home. And as he watched, they merged into one, turned on its side, and flashed a beam of light directly at him. It left him quite dazed and a little bit disoriented. He stumbled back into his room and fell asleep, woke up the next morning, and got quite a shock. Prior to this gentleman, this medical doctor, was suffering from partial paralysis from injuries received during the Algerian War years earlier. He had been a professional piano player, had to give it up because of his paralysis. And 2 or 3 days prior to this incident, he had been chopping wood. The axe slipped and he gashed his ankle and had a serious wound on his ankle. He wakes up the next morning and his paralysis is gone. He's no longer limping. He's able to take up piano playing again. And furthermore, the wound on his ankle had disappeared. So he was actually cured of 2 different conditions, something which is actually fairly common. 10 to 15% of the reported cases involve people who were cured of multiple conditions in one incident. Some people are cured of multiple conditions over a period of years. But this was one of the first cases that made me start to question who is being healed and why. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Another researcher, Timothy Green Beckley, interviewed a syndicated columnist from New York by the name of Brandon Blackman, who on July 8, 1974, was with a group of people in Prospect Park in New York when a UFO showed up and started circling around them. And then it took off. It was a simple sighting, or so Brandon Blackman thought, until he got home and realized he had somehow locked himself out of his house. This was impossible because he had the keys with him. His keys were missing and he couldn't get back inside. So he knew he had his keys because he can't lock the door. And he couldn't find his keys, so he called the supervisor who let him into his apartment, and there were his keys on his bed. So that was a curious detail, but that's when he noticed that a cut on his hand, which had been bandaged up, he took the bandage off to replace, the bandage and clean the wound. The cut was gone. So he says he did not have missing time. There was no encounter in terms of, being taken on board or seeing ETs or anything. It was just the mere presence of the UFO, apparently, that healed him, though there are some weird aspects to this case, like these missing keys. There are many, many cases of people healed of flesh wounds. Again, one of the most common. One from Gordon Creighton involves a gentleman by the name of Hans Klotzbach, who jumped from a moving train while trying to emigrate through Europe in 1952 and broke both his legs. And he was lying there by the side of the train tracks when he was pulled on board a UFO. And the human-looking ETs told him that you are a good man, you are doing good work for humanity, and we will heal you. And he says they healed him of his broken legs. I interviewed a gentleman from Belgium who had severe problems with his foot. It was swelling up. The doctors were not able to diagnose it. It was getting worse and worse. He was not responding to any treatments, therapy, laser treatments. And he eventually was at the point of becoming wheelchair bound. He was quite young, a very athletic man. And he went to the local park and prayed for a healing. About 5 to 10% of the cases involved people who prayed for a healing and received one. And he said that evening he was in his bedroom when 3 figures showed up. He perceived one as being a doctor and the other 2 as guards. Initially, he thought actually he was being robbed and assaulted because one of them grabbed his foot and started twisting it painfully, his sore foot. And he fought them all the way and eventually fell unconscious and woke up the next morning and instantly ran down the stairs to check to see if the door was locked. And when he got to the door and it was locked, he realized he had actually run down the stairs, something he had not been able to do. He was on crutches at this point, and he realized he had been healed. So many cases of this. Just another real quick involves a gentleman by the name of Jim Law from Gainesville, Florida, who was suffering from a hernia. Suddenly he woke up and there were gray ETs surrounding his bed. This was something he had been dealing with his entire life. It was very scary in the beginning, but he had gotten over his fear. He was kind of used to seeing these guys. He had seen them so often. And he said, hey, if you're going to take me, why don't you fix my hernia? And they said, and I quote, we know of the condition that you speak of, and we will repair it. And they did. They used a small handheld instrument to cure Jim of his hernia. And he asked them then, why are you taking me? Why do you keep taking me? And the ETs said, we are interested in your genetic potential to live a long time. I found that very interesting. So did he, actually, because his grandfather was 107 years old and still active and healthy. And I found it interesting because many of the contactees I've interviewed have enjoyed really excellent health well into their 80s and 90s. And many of them feel like they've been upgraded in some way. And I think, honestly, this is something that's been going on for quite some time on a large scale basis. Because if you look back a couple of 100 years, human longevity was not nearly where it is today. The average date of passing was somewhere in people's 40s or 50s. And now it's moved up to 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I think what ETs are actually doing is upgrading our genetics to increase human longevity. Another case occurred in 1975 to Sergeant Charles Moody, who came upon a landed UFO and was pulled on board. He was quite frightened and fought them. He tried to shoot at them, was not able to. They dragged him on board, and during this process, they injured his back. And I've got about 10 cases where people received an injury on board a UFO or while being pulled on board. That's true in his case. The ETs pulled out a cylindrical instrument, one I've heard described from many contactees, and healed him of back pain. And it ended up becoming quite a benevolent case. Once he got over his fear, they showed him the UFO, took him to the engine room, took him to the helm, told him that they will be announcing themselves to humanity at some point. It's a very interesting and well authenticated case. But it's interesting to me because he was injured on board a UFO and healed by the ETs, which does happen in a few cases. But I have to tell you, each of these categories, I have dozens of cases. I've got many cases of people who are healed of back pain. One lady I interviewed was from Norway. She contacted me because she wanted to share her account. She has no history of UFO encounters. And I was trying to figure out who's being healed and why. Half the people I interviewed or looked into had a history of UFO encounters. So it was clear to me that that was a factor. But otherwise, it was evenly divided between men and women. I talked to people who were very young, who were healed, people who were quite elderly, people of all races, people all over the world. It had nothing to do with political affiliation, education, blood type, race, religion. I could find no real patterns other than if you had a history of this, then you were more likely to be healed. And then I interviewed this lady from Norway who had no history of UFO encounters. And she described grays appearing around her bed one evening. She was quite frightened. She said they started flipping her around like a rag doll, put her on her stomach, took out this cylindrical instrument and pressed it against her back. She felt pulsations of electricity or energy coming from it. And it was very quick. She was asking questions. They never spoke to her in any way. Just pressed this instrument against her back, stepped back, walked through the wall. She looked out the window, saw a very eerie blue light, jumped up and looked out the window, but this light winked out and everything was back to normal. And this was when she realized that her chronic back pain from a severe injury some years earlier was gone. They had healed her back pain. And I asked her, what she did for a living. She says, well, I'm a graphic artist, but please don't use my name because I'm retired and currently I am very active in my country in civil rights, and human rights activist and animal rights. And that really struck a chord with me because I had started to realize that many of the people who I had interviewed were social rights workers. They were doctors, they were teachers, inventors, entertainers, musicians, police officers, artists, people who are doing good work for humanity in some way. Quite a few doctors. So that was when I started to realize this is an absolute pattern. The people who are being healed are people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. One gentleman is a contactee. He's claiming to have friendly contacts with human-looking ETs. And I honestly, when I started doing this research, thought that this was where most of the healing cases were coming from people who claimed contact with human-looking ETs. It turns out that most of the healings are actually being done by grays. But this gentleman, Richard Rilke from New Jersey, says that he has been healed on at least 5 different occasions. As a little kid in the 1950s, he had a sled accident, which led to a very severe ear infection. And ETs showed up and cured him using lights. Another time he was working at a factory and his finger was badly crushed. He went to the nurse. She said, "You're going to lose that finger. You need to go to the emergency room now. This is beyond my capacity to treat." He went to the hospital, and while he was waiting to be treated, his ET friends, as he calls them, showed up and they said, "We will repair your finger," and used a handheld flashlight-like instrument and healed his finger. And the doctors came in and said, "Why are you here? You look fine." And he says, "I'm sorry, I thought my finger was injured worse than it is." And he went to work the next day, and the nurse came running up to him because she was surprised to see him there. And she grabbed his hand and became quite upset when she saw his finger because it was perfectly healed. She said, "How did this happen?" And he told her. He says, "I am a contactee. The ETs healed me." And she had no choice but to believe him. Many of the people I've talked to keep their encounters secret. They're afraid of ridicule, disbelief, or being put in a mental hospital, which has happened to people I've spoken to. So there is a danger of that, but some people do tell their doctors. So he's had a number of healings. I mean, once he had a tumor on his face, which all his friends saw. More than 50 people testified to this tumor, which suddenly disappeared. Another gentleman I interviewed is Jerry Wills from Kentucky, who as a young boy had lots of UFO sightings and was approached by a human-looking ET who began to teach him all these science and philosophical subjects. And as a little boy, had a very severe fever, and suddenly grays surrounded his bed, and he was pulled on board, physically examined. They gave him injections and pills and cured him of his fever. And he is now a prominent psychic healer in this field. And that is absolutely a pattern I see. Many people who are taken on board believe that they now have the ability to heal. Another really interesting case comes from Leonard Stringfield, a very well-respected pioneering researcher. I love this case. It's just so strange. It involves a young 13-year-old boy by the name of Chuck Doyle from Florence, Kentucky, who saw a UFO from his backyard, was hovering over the neighbor's pool, and as he watched it, it sent down a beam of light, which came towards him. He was frightened. He quickly turned to run, but this beam of light struck him, and he was unable to move. And he says, while he was in this beam of light, all these weird symbols appeared in his mind, mathematical equations, colors, shapes, geometric shapes, weird landscapes, weird looking buildings, all this information, a lot of it right over his head. He couldn't understand it. It was quite brief. This beam retracted, and he ran back inside to tell his mom, who ran outside and saw this object moving away. And that's when they noticed his severe head cold was gone. They immediately called the doctor, and the doctor came in and examined Chuck Doyle and gave him a clean bill of health. I don't know why ETs would fly light years or wherever they're coming from to cure a little boy of a head cold. But I've got a lot of cases like this, many cases of people healed of colds, flus, and minor illnesses. One gentleman by the name of Jim Sparks, who is what we would call a conscious contactee. He is not needed to go under hypnosis. He remembers his experiences fully consciously with gray ETs, was very sick with the flu. ETs showed up and said, do you remember our contract? We said we would heal you if you ever got in trouble. You should have gone to the doctor. Your flu is quite serious. And he says, oh, I didn't realize I was that sick. And they said, don't worry, we will heal you. And they did. And later, he was taken on board, and the ETs handed him these vials filled with black goo, which actually was quite noxious. It smelled really bad. And they said, this is our gift to you. And he didn't think this was much of a gift, this black tar-like substance. And he said, what's this? And they said, we removed this from your lungs. You need to stop smoking. He was a heavy smoker. And they showed him images of him becoming quite ill. So needless to say, he did stop smoking. I find this case interesting because there was another gentleman who reported the exact same experience. ETs took him on board, showed him all this black goo. The only difference was the shape of the vials that they held this stuff in. And they said, this is our gift to you. We've extracted this from your lungs. You need to stop smoking. And he did, though the ETs showed up again because the man had started smoking marijuana. And they said, you need to stop smoking marijuana. This is not the life we had planned for you. There are many cases of ETs who will dispense dietary or health advice. One lady was taken on board and the ETs told her, you need to stop eating fatty foods. This is not good for you. She was not happy to be called fat by the Greys, but they were apparently interested in her health. So many, many cases like that. One case from Dr. Edith Fiore involves two sisters who were cured of a yeast infection. It returned for one of the ladies, so not all of these cases are permanent healings, but they're healing all different types of illnesses. And in fact, she was later cured of cancer. And this was the type of instrument that they used to heal her. All different illnesses and types, parts of the body are being healed. Here's a night watchman who was 73 years old when he had an encounter outside his home with these figures pictured on the right, and was struck by a beam of light. And he did suffer some symptoms mimicking radiation sickness, but following this incident, he started to grow a third set of teeth. And in fact, he was examined quite extensively by more than 60 doctors, 60, police officers, government officials, UFO researchers, and all who verified his case. There was quite a bit of evidence, physical evidence surrounding his case. And yeah, he started to grow new teeth, which is quite unusual, but many of these cases involve what we would call chronic conditions. I think that's a misnomer. There is no such thing as a chronic condition. We just don't understand how to heal it. One gentleman from West Virginia was taken on board, and he had an impacted wisdom tooth, and he asked the ETs to heal it, and they did. So yeah, extraterrestrial dentists, it's not common. It's one of the more rare types of healings, but it does take place. What is quite common are eye cures. On December 9th, 1968, a Peruvian customs official was out on his veranda. He saw a metallic disc quite high up. It sent down a purple beam of light, which struck him on the head and chest and retracted. And immediately following this, he was cured of two conditions. He was severely myopic, nearsighted, and had to take off his glasses to see because now his vision was 20/20. He was cured of nearsightedness pretty much instantly. He also suffered from chronic rheumatism, and that cleared up over the next week. So here's another example of someone who was cured of multiple conditions. And I've got many cases of people who were cured of eye disease. Here's Howard Menger, who was on Okinawa when he was injured by an exploding shell up from a bomb and had his eye become infected. It spread to his other eye. He became totally blind until he was visited in his hospital tent by a mysterious nurse who no one was ever able to identify. He asked about her and they said, "No, we have no nurse. We are the only ones who have been in here." But he later was taken on board and met this nurse. He recognized her voice and she said, "Yes, I am the one who healed you. You are going to be doing important work, and that's why we healed you." Here's two ladies, Anna Jamerson and Beth Collings, who wrote a book called Connections. And Beth Collings on the left here had a UFO encounter, following which her eyesight went back to normal. Before, she had to wear glasses. And her friend had the same experience. Suddenly her vision became normal, and that's what clued her into the fact that she was having contact. So in many cases, I mean, there's one gentleman who was cured of color blindness. He had his eyeball actually removed by the ETs and put back in. And as a result, his profound color blindness was almost completely cured. The only color he couldn't see was green. I've talked to many people who've been cured. One lady was cured of glaucoma by praying mantis ETs. Her doctor was absolutely shocked because her optic nerve, which had become quite thin, was now almost normal. Here's a police officer from England who came upon a UFO hovering overhead on the road in front of him. He had missing time. He was ridiculed mercilessly by his fellow officers and his supervisors, even though there was a flood of calls from other witnesses who had seen UFOs in the area at the same time. The ridicule never stopped. He was asked to resign. He refused. They took away his police cruiser and gave him a bicycle. He still refused to quit. At some point, they even planted drugs in his locker to discredit him. And it had just reached a point where everything he loved about being a police officer was gone. I will say he had won awards for his police service and for his investigations into various crimes. So it's quite a tragic case. During one of his police outings, his investigations, he was assaulted by criminals who attacked him and rendered him infertile. He was injured quite badly and went to the doctor, and doctor told him, "You will never have kids." One evening, he and his wife were in bed. His wife woke up, could not wake up, Alan. She heard this very loud buzzing noise over the house, was afraid to go outside. She fell asleep. The next morning, they woke up and became intimate for the first time in quite some time, and she became pregnant. And when that happened, she accused him of sleeping around. And he says, "No, I didn't. No, I love you. I would never do that." They ended up going to the doctor. The doctor was absolutely astonished because his condition of infertility had been reversed. Got many cases like this. From Brad Steiger has a case. Barbara Lamb has a case. I have another case myself. So the point is, many people are being cured of a wide variety of conditions. Another excellent case occurred to Carl Higdon in 1976 in Rawlins, Wyoming. He's an oil field worker. He was out hunting elk when he came upon a landed UFO and a strange humanoid figure. He was pulled on board this craft. It's quite an involved experience. He saw elk in a glass cage. He believes he was taken to another planet. It's a long, involved encounter. But what's important here is, following this, he was cured of two conditions. He went to the doctor at the urging of UFO researchers, and the doctor was shocked because Carl Higdon had scars from tuberculosis on his lungs, chronic scarring, and there was no evidence that he had ever had tuberculosis following this encounter. And not only that, he had suffered from kidney stones, and following this encounter, his kidney stones were gone. And many cases of people cured of kidney stones. A case comes from Constance Clear involving a gentleman by the name of Andrew from Texas, who was taken on board and was being examined by Grays. And they said, "What are these objects in your kidney? Is that for your health?" And Andrew said, "No, those are kidney stones. They are not for my health. And in fact, if you leave them in there, I will probably become quite ill." And they said, "Oh, well, we will remove them when we contact you next." And some months later, they took him on board and did an examination and put this instrument next to him and cured him. Well, Andrew did this drawing pictured here. The researcher Constance Clear took this drawing to a doctor and asked him what he thought of it. And the doctor said, "Oh, well, I recognize this instrument. This is something that we use ourselves to cure people of kidney stones." So I know of many other cases. One gentleman was a friend of a contactee, was being rushed to the hospital to be treated for kidney stones. On the way to the hospital, a UFO showed up, circled around his car. His pain went away, and they went to the hospital anyway, and they found no evidence of his kidney stones. So many cases like this. Kidney disease as well. One case involved a lady who went to the doctor because she was unable to urinate for about 2 or 3 days. The doctor was shocked. He said, "You should have come much sooner. You're suffering from total renal failure. If you don't go to the emergency room right now, you are in danger of passing away." She was, of course, horrified, went directly home to alert her family, friends, and coworkers to pray for her, and intended to go to the hospital, but fell asleep on her bed, woke up to see little humanoids surrounding her bed and working on her. She woke up the next morning and was able to go to the bathroom, went to her doctor. He was absolutely shocked. He said, "What happened?" She says, "I don't know. I think angels healed me." And that's what she told everyone. But it was about a month or two later, she was taken on board a craft. There were those same humanoids, a rounded room, a table, your typical description of the interior of a UFO. And the ETs showed her organs, her inner organs, using an instrument I've heard described many times. It's very much like an X-ray machine, except it displays a person's inner organs in a hologram in full living color. They showed her kidneys. And they said, look, your kidneys are now perfectly healthy. Don't they look good? And she said, yes, thank you. And then they showed her an image of her liver, which had all these dark spots on it. And they said, do you see these dark spots? She said, yes. They said, this is because you are drinking too much Diet Coke. You need to stop drinking so much Diet Coke. It is damaging your liver. So this is another example of someone who asked for a healing and received it. And also another case of someone who was given health advice by the ETs. So I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. I still have about 10 cases I'd like to share for you. I know I've spoken for an hour, so I'm going to go another 10 minutes or so, if that's okay. Here's Bill Hamilton. Here's Bill Hamilton, a Southern California-based UFO researcher who interviewed a lady who was diagnosed with a cyst. It appeared on MRI and X-rays, and it was a cystic mass in her breast. And she was on the way to the doctor. Or no, actually, she had just been diagnosed and was driving home, and a UFO showed up. And her son said, look, Mom, this is a good sign. I think they know about your problem. And it was the day before surgery. She had gone to bed and had an encounter, went to the doctor the next day. The cystic mass was gone. This is a very well authenticated case. I spoke to the lady personally, and there are before and after X-rays showing the disappearance of this cyst. And I have another case personally involving a lady who had the same exact experience. The night before surgery, she had a cyst in her fallopian tubes. It was on MRI, it was causing all kinds of pain and bleeding and problems. The night before surgery, ETs showed up and healed her. She went to the doctor. The doctors were shocked. They did the pre-op imaging and could not find her cyst and accused her of having surgery at another hospital, which she denied. And they said, well, we know you're lying because your cyst is gone. There's fluid that's present in your fallopian tube, which can only be present after surgery. Where did you have surgery? And she continued to deny it. And they said, well, what are these laser scars on your stomach? And she did not want to tell them because she was afraid of being disbelieved. The doctors sent her home because her cyst was gone. So many, many cases like that. Chris Bledsoe, pictured here, suffered from Crohn's disease, a digestive disorder, for many years, and was at the point of being in a wheelchair and was taking an enormous amount of medication. And his condition was slowly deteriorating until he was taken on board a UFO and instantly cured of Crohn's disease. So I have many cases like that. One gentleman, Fred White of Durham, England, was diagnosed with a hole in his heart and was being set up for surgery in his hospital room when this figure, a human-looking figure, though he looked exotic, had very strange eyes, was dressed strangely, showed up and said, I am going to heal you, and did, using this handheld instrument, which appeared very much like a watch, but wasn't a watch. It had no dial on it, and told this gentleman, Fred White, that he was being healed because they were very interested in his work with electronics. Fred White was an electronics engineer and an inventor. So this is another clue as to who is being healed and why. Got many cases of people healed of heart disease. Here's an illustration from Katarina Wilson, who was struck by lightning in Florida and ran inside to call the doctor, but instead Grays showed up and they said, we need to repair your heart. It was damaged due to this lightning strike. She said it was quite painful, actually, but they healed her, and there was no evidence that she had been struck by lightning afterwards. Here's another case which really provided a clue as to who's being healed and why. This is John Hunter Gray, a civil rights worker who's won multiple awards for his work in civil rights. Had a missing time abduction with his son. but afterwards spontaneously remembered being taken by grays and given several injections in various parts of his body. And following this, he says he had more than 20 physiological improvements. He started having all his scars healed up. He lost weight. He stopped smoking. He grew 2 inches. Mind you, he's middle-aged. His feet grew 2 sizes. His cuts and scars started healing at rapid rates. He stopped getting the flu. Numerous physiological improvements. And again, I think it's because he's doing good work for humanity, which is why he was healed. And he had what amounts to a health upgrade. John Mack talked about this. Researcher R.D. Six Killer Clark interviewed a gentleman who was a bicycle racer. He was taken on board. Afterwards, he started winning all his bicycle races. He said it was stronger and faster, and he attributes it to his UFO encounter. So again, these are what I would call a health upgrade. But some people have been healed of very serious illnesses. Here's a gentleman by the name of Ted from Northern California who suffering from angioma. That's a chronic malformation of the blood vessels in the brain, which can be very serious and fatal, and appeared to be in his case because his condition was deteriorating to the point where he was paralyzed, losing vision, losing the ability to speak, and was taken on board a craft. He says they actually cut open his head and put laser-like instruments on his brain and cured the malformation of his blood vessels. And he experienced a complete recovery. Doctors were so shocked, they ordered exploratory brain surgery and were amazed to see that he was now normal. So many, many cases of people who were cured of absolutely chronic illnesses. Here's the instrument that Ted described, and here's one of the ETs that he had seen. So many different types of ETs are doing these healings. There was a rash of healings in the area of Tbilisi in Russia, where people were basically praying for UFO encounter because people were being healed of heart disease, of diabetes, of kidney disease. Just a huge number of healings were taking place in this one area. Here's a book, Secret Vows, about the Twiggs family. They have had encounters their whole life, which started out very scary, but ended up being quite benevolent, and each of them have experienced healings of some kind. Denise Twiggs said that she was healed of scars from a cesarean section. Bert Twiggs was cured of severe flu. Their child was cured of asthma. Another child was cured of a sty in his eye. Here's Sisto Paz Wells. He is very well known for being able to call down UFOs and did a sort of CE5, it's called, a human-initiated contact in Sebago Cabins in upstate New York, where a bunch of people saw UFOs. One of the attendees was a professional dancer who was suffering from arthritis in his legs and had to give up dancing, but that evening had an encounter and his arthritis was healed and he was able to take up dancing again. Here's another case which I love. This is Joy Davies and her dog. This case occurred in Pennsylvania in 2012. Joy Davies was suffering from severe arthritis and was walking outside her home when she came upon a landed UFO, and short, human-looking, well, largely human-looking, but they were hairless and had dark eyes and were very short, ETs. She remembers being taken on board. It was a very pleasant experience. They were very kind to her. And next thing she knows, she's walking back to her home. And when she wakes up the next morning, her arthritis is gone. She was able to take up tennis playing again. And not only that, her dog, who was quite aged, also suffered from arthritis, also appeared to be healed. And not the only case I have of animals being healed. I have several cases of animals being healed. Here's Cynthia Hind, who interviewed a lady who was cured of jaundice, a liver infection. Got several cases of that. Here's a gentleman who is the kindest man you would ever want to meet. He is a reverend. He is a hands-on healer. He's a social rights worker who was commended by President Clinton for his work against racism. He was diagnosed with a blood clot in his leg. His leg had swollen up to more than twice its size. The doctor was quite alarmed, chided him for not coming earlier to the doctor, prescribed a bunch of medication for him, and sent him home for what he said would be a months-long recovery. But that's not what happened. Michael Carter is his name, woke up to see a beautiful, muscular, human-looking male dressed in a jumpsuit standing at the foot of his bed. This man held up his hand, palm forward, and sent a beam of light onto Michael, which left him dazed and somewhat disoriented. And he fell asleep and woke up the next morning and was very excited to tell his family what had happened. He does have a history of encounters. Had never seen a human-looking ET before, had always seen grays. But when he got out of bed, his leg was normal size. In fact, the veins and arteries looked like they had been rerouted. His leg was now normal. He went to the doctor. The doctor was absolutely shocked and asked him what happened. And Michael Carter said, I don't know. It must be a miracle. Just be happy for me. Like many people, he does not want to tell his doctor. Here's a case involving a contactee pictured here on the left, João Valerio, who was a hospital doorman and well known and respected. And people around him believed he was having contact because there was quite some good evidence for it. And in the hospital, a young boy who was loved in the community had suffered a cerebral aneurysm and was expected to die. And the doctors asked João Valerio if he could contact his ET friends and ask them to heal this boy. And João Valerio said he would try. So he contacted the ETs pictured here and asked them, and they said, okay, we will do what we can, and gave him this medicine pictured here. They told him just to rub it into the boy's skin, and this will cure his nervous system, which the doctors did. And they were absolutely shocked when this boy's nervous system regrew and he was cured of this aneurysm. He was expected to pass away. They actually did analyze this medicine, which was found to be chemically unique, that the appearance of raw sugar, a crystalline appearance that melted at body temperature, but they were not able to identify what it was. So just a couple more cases. I want to talk a little bit about cancer cures. There are many, many cases. One lady by the name of Helena Charbonneau was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and doctors expected her to pass away. Her condition deteriorated quite quickly. They tried to do an operation, but weren't able to remove the cancer completely, and it spread throughout her body into her breast, liver, kidney, and spleen. And she had lost 50 pounds. Doctors expected her to die, and she said, can I go home and pass away at home? And they said, okay. And she went home, and that's when she was taken on board a UFO, and she had a very long operation. And the ETs told her that they had been requested to heal her. Turns out she had a friend who was a contactee. And she said it was a long, painful operation. And she woke up and was rushed to the hospital when she started vomiting, and her condition was deteriorating. And incredibly, she rallied. Her health started to improve, and the cancer was gone. Many, many cases of this. I have, like I said, some 40 cases. A lady from France was cured of throat cancer. One lady I interviewed, Lycia Davidson, was taken on board and healed of terminal cancer. She said it was very painful. One lady, a councilwoman from Florida, pictured here, Lynn Plaskett, had Hodgkin's disease. And this little tiny UFO appeared, circled around her bed. She was levitated, and it healed her. One gentleman I interviewed actually filmed an orb as it went into his body. This is the only case I know of someone who actually filmed his UFO healing. And here's the orb pictured here. At the time, he was suffering from cancer, had a huge tumor on his neck. And the next morning, this tumor was gone. And he did tell his doctors. He was always very upfront with his doctors. His doctors did the operation to remove necrotic tissue, but there was no sign of cancer. He sent me his medical records. The doctors did not say ETs healed him because they couldn't prove it, but they did put miraculous healing or spontaneous remission in his file. Here is Reynero Hernandez, who did a study on UFO healing cases, and he found that, again, 50% of people who report UFO encounters report healings. And he got into UFOs when his dog was healed. So these healings take many different forms. There are people who have been healed as a result of lightning strike. Mary Clamser was healed of multiple sclerosis after being struck by lightning. I found over 50 cases of people healed by lightning strike. So there's a similarity there. And people are not only being healed, they're being rescued. Pictured here is a lady I interviewed who had a motorcycle accident. And she was stranded on this mountain road. And she herself was fine, but the motorcycle wasn't. And she doesn't know what she was going to do because she couldn't get the motorcycle started. It had an old-fashioned Kickstarter. And these ETs showed up, told her to step back, and fixed her bike. And she was able to drive away. I've got many cases like this. One group of people were on a boat that was sinking when a UFO showed up. And the rescuers were able to pinpoint their location because of this UFO. And they were taken off the boat only an hour before it sank. Lillian Richter, pictured here, had a UFO show up and made her car stall. And finally, this UFO went on its way and she continued her trip home. And right in front of her, she came upon a very horrific car accident. And she believed that she would have been involved had she not been delayed by this UFO. And finally, here is the Integratron. This is built by contactee George Van Tassel on the instruction of ETs who told them that this was to rejuvenate people's health. Unfortunately, George Van Tassel passed away before it could be completed, which is really unfortunate because the ETs told him that this would allow people to have a much longer lifespan. This is located in Southern California, and it would have been awesome if this had been finished because this is something a number of contactees have received information on how to do healing. This is a very common thing. Whitley Strieber, pictured here, says he receives letters every day from people requesting a healing. I receive many, many emails from people asking for a healing. There are some people who have requested a healing and received it. It's quite rare, but it does happen. I do think most of these are being unreported and that many people are being healed, but are interpreting it perhaps as angelic. I think angels are probably real and healing people as well. Healing can come in many different forms, from a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, many different ways. But ETs are definitely healing people. I'm absolutely convinced this is one of their main agendas. It shows a very positive side to ET contact that hasn't received enough attention, which is why I'm very passionate about this and letting people know that ETs are not here to hurt people. I have virtually no cases of what I would call sadistic behavior or torture or ETs wanting to hurt people. The very first thing they tell people is, do not be afraid. We are not here to harm you. Have no fear. You will not be hurt. And it can be very scary, but people who overcome their fear do not have their memories suppressed. They're not paralyzed. They are given a healing. They're given a tour of the craft, shown the engine room, told how it works. They're taken to the helm, allowed to fly the craft. This is not unusual. And anyone who's given any message of any kind, it's almost always warnings, warnings of nuclear proliferation, warning against greed and corruption, warning against our warlike ways, warnings against pollution and cutting down the forests, and these kinds of things. This shows a very positive side of UFO contact. What actually happens to people who are taken on board who have contact is very positive. And as a general rule, people who are taken on board are returned and have a psychic awakening, a spiritual enlightenment and suddenly start displaying a wide variety of psychic abilities, such as precognition, clairvoyance, telepathy, levitation, past life recall, the ability of astral travel, channeling, and most prominently, healing. Many, many people become very interested in healing. As a general rule, contactees are the nicest people you will ever meet, and they are working very hard to help humanity. And that is why the ETs are healing people. And they have told people this. They said, we can't just step in and heal everyone. It's up to you to solve your own problems. And we are helping people who are helping others. And one final note, there are some whistleblowers who have worked in the crash retrieval aspect of UFO contact. We do have these craft. We do have some of the technology taken from the craft. And there are reports from whistleblowers saying that some of this healing technology has been removed and is being used secretly by the military. And there are such instruments that can heal flesh wounds, that can diagnose tumors, that can reverse aging to a certain degree. So hopefully at some point this technology will be released. But again, the ETs are not going to come down and heal everyone, because that would likely cause more problems than we're already facing. And we would have to deal with abuse of technology and overpopulation and other things like this. But that's basically my presentation. I am confident that ETs are here to heal us. And I want to thank you very much for listening and watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Preston. Fascinating, just fascinating. It begs the question about why.
Yes, that's the central issue here.
What's going on?
I feel like our relationship to the ETs is much closer than people realize. There are human-looking ETs. The Greys themselves, although they look different, are essentially human, share the same genetics. We all share the same genetics.
Is that right?
Yep, but the research is showing, and people are over and over again, the message from contactees is, we are one. You are us, we are you. They feel very close to us, and like they're very ethical, very moral, and very highly technologically advanced, very spiritually advanced, and feel a responsibility to help when they can. This is their goal. There are numerous agendas from the ETs, but they are absolutely doing their best to uplift us, educate us, advance our spirituality, heal us when they can. But again, they can't just step in and solve our problems. As every parent knows, you can't do everything for your child. You have to solve your own problems. You have to learn how to tie your own shoes.
Grow. Yeah.
Preston, thank you very much for validating some of my experiences and for your dedication to your research. The one question I have of you is there any evidence of shape-shifting? Are they able to change to humanoids or other forms?
Yes, absolutely. They do have the ability to do this. I do believe when people see Greys, that is what they look like, because there are so many accounts of it. But there are some people who find that appearance quite frightening, and they will take on a human-looking form. But again, human is also one of the most common types. But they do have the ability to put forth what we would call a screen memory. So some people will see everything. I mean, I've heard all of it, particularly with children. They will appear as clowns, perhaps, or teddy bears, or superheroes, or Barbie dolls. Many people come away from an experience thinking they saw an owl, perhaps, or a deer, or some animal. And they will take on an appearance that you might find comforting. The lady I showed who was healed of an eye condition was a horse farmer. And the ET she saw was clearly a Grey, she could tell, but wore a cowboy hat and a mustache, and basically was coming in an appearance to sort of reduce the fear factor. This doesn't always work, particularly with the clowns. That's cause of chlorophobia, the fear of clowns in our society. But yeah, they absolutely do have the ability to dress up perhaps in a way that will reduce the fear factor, or just put on a full-on, like you said, shape-shifting or screen memory.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I have a question. How do they speak? With plain English, or I mean, are they good fluent in our language, or are they, like the movies, like, they would speak funny?
Yeah, almost as a rule. Thanks, Phyllis. That's a great question. As a rule, they do speak telepathically. And this is generally speaking in your home language. I mean, I interviewed a guy from the Netherlands, and they said, do not be afraid, we won't hurt you, in his native language. If you're Spanish, they'll speak to you in Spanish. This is not always the case. Some people don't necessarily hear words as we would think of it, but basically have just thought transfer and are given sort of an understanding of, like, do not be afraid, we won't hurt you. It's not necessarily in spoken English. They do speak telepathically. Some people do hear them audibly, though, particularly the human-looking ETs. They will speak normally in your language. They do have their own language. People have heard this, but very few people have been able to understand it. I have talked to a few people who have learned some words here and there. But yeah, they will speak to you in your native language.
Okay, Preston, do you feel there's any connection at all with religion, the Bible, Jesus' miracles, the passage in Ezekiel with wheels with eyes round about them?
Yes, there is some connection here. There are some cases where people are very religious and feel this is an angelic phenomenon, or some people who are quite frightened might interpret this as a demonic visitation. ETs themselves do not appear to have an organized religion like we do, other than that they do agree that there's a source, that we are all one, and that love is the answer. This is a quote from many ETs. Love is the answer for humankind. One lady I interviewed, the ETs told her, who you thought were angels was us. I did a lot of research into angels, and I'm quite convinced that they do exist. And if you look at the writings of angelic encounters, Jacques Vallée has done a study of this. It does appear that there could be a bleed through here, where some people who thought they were visited by ETs were probably visited by angels. And some people who thought they were visited by angels may have been visited by ETs. And many people have written about the similarities of UFO accounts in the Bible and other sacred writings, which sound very much like a UFO encounter, such as Ezekiel's encounter, or the book of Enoch is also referenced quite often. And I have to tell you, there are people who said that this is quite rare, but it does happen. And I have interviewed people who have had this experience, who are taken on board and see who they believe is a religious figure, whether this is Mother Mary or Jesus or Michael, the Archangel Michael. This does happen. I think in some cases, a person with very strong religious beliefs may interpret this through the lens of that belief. So there is some possibility of that. Most people who have these encounters interpret it as traditional extraterrestrials, as we would think of it. But yeah, there's absolutely some connection to religion here.
Are there any accounts of the dead being revived?
Yes, it's quite rare. One lady I did interview who had a very severe car accident in Georgia was pulled from the scene of the accident, and the ETs told her that she had actually died in this accident. Her brainstem was completely severed. And they said, you were karmically not supposed to die, and we will heal you. And she said it took quite some time, and they healed her and put her back in the scene of the accident. And they told her, we are not able to heal all your injuries because some of these are karmic. And this is, I think, one reason why some people aren't being healed, because the ETs respect our free will, our autonomy, and they are not going to step in and heal someone who has chosen illness for the purpose of spiritual growth. This is a school we're coming down here on earth, and people will choose a difficult lifetime or go through a difficult experience for the purpose of spiritual growth. And ETs are not able to heal some people because they do not want to rob you of your opportunity to grow spiritually by overcoming a hardship. But yeah, there are a handful of cases where people were told that they had actually passed away. Another gentleman had a motorcycle accident, and the ET said, "You are not supposed to die. You have a very important mission on this planet. You're going to help a lot of people, and that's why we are healing you." So yeah, that does happen, but it's quite rare.
Yeah, one more question. Is there any evidence or any discussion about humans first coming to this planet from outer space?
Yes, I mean, this is an area of research that I'm not particularly specialized in. The idea of ancient aliens is quite popular. There's really good evidence that ETs have been visiting us for millennia, and that there were, in fact, prior advanced civilizations before ours, such as Atlantis or Lemuria, and probably more before that. There are the ancient, or the Vijnanas of ancient India, which were flying machines, which are very well documented in very old writings from ancient India. There are hieroglyphs from ancient Egypt, which show that there were probably ET visitations. Many, many indigenous cultures, not only across the US, but across the world, have oral traditions pointing towards the fact that they are descended directly from human-looking extraterrestrials. And again, human origins is not perfectly understood. Evolution is, fairly well documented, but we don't know for sure how humans originated on this planet. And the fact that some ETs look just like us does raise serious questions about human origins. And some people have been told that we, in fact, did not come from this planet and that we were transported here. That's a very difficult question to prove one way or the other. But I think there are some serious questions about who we are, our relationship to ETs, and did we actually evolve on this planet? Because we're not perfectly well suited for Earth. The gravity is quite a bit more severe and causes problems for us. And we have a very narrow temperature that we can survive in. And there's been quite some interesting research into that. Again, not my area of expertise. I've certainly followed it, and I find it quite interesting. But at this point, we don't know exactly what has gone on in the far distant past and what our relationship is to these ETs, and whether or not we came or originated here on Earth.
Thank you.
Back in the 80s, like in 1982, North Dakota was a lot of UFO encounterings. But yet, when you mentioned the people that you encountered with UFOs, it was mostly California, Arizona, and Tennessee, I think. Have you ever did any things with the North Dakotians? Because my husband and I went up there, and he was going to get a job up there, and it was really prominent of all the UFOs that came there. I don't know if they cured anyone, but I just was wondering with your research if you did anything with that area.
Well, I'm going through my head here. I don't know if I've ever interviewed personally anyone from North Dakota, but absolutely there are encounters. If you go to like NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, you can look, or MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, they both have extensive databases. And I will tell you, I know for a fact that there are hundreds of cases in every state. California has the most of any state in the US, but we are the most populated, 40 million people. Whereas North Dakota's population is one of the lowest in the US. North Dakota, Wyoming, a few of these states are not densely populated, And so we see a direct correlation to the number of people as to the number of UFO reports. About 10% of the people report UFOs. Yes, there are sightings, encounters everywhere in every state in the US, all across the world. There is really not any one location on Earth that does not have reported cases.
Oh, thank you.
You had mentioned that they were concerned about the karma of one of the people that they had healed. And I was wondering if there was any information about where, you know, if they go to the afterlife too, and what maybe their purpose is.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of information on this because this is not something that's commonly reported. But I have talked to people who, yes, have been told that the ETs do have an afterlife, as we all do. You know, people say perhaps these are not ETs, they're interdimensional beings. And my response would be, we are all interdimensional. We also have an afterlife. I've done quite a bit of research into out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, mediumship, ghosts. The evidence for an afterlife with humans is very extensive and quite compelling. And there's every indication that the ETs are biological beings like us from other planets who also have a soul and do have an afterlife. And there are people who have reported seeing extraterrestrial spirits or being educated in that regard. The ETs are quite long-lived. As near as we can tell, they live anywhere from 300 to 1,000 years and do not look at death like we do. There are many people, particularly skeptics, who look at death as the end. It's not. Death is a misnomer. It does not exist. Death is like walking through a doorway and moving to Hawaii. It is a wonderful place on the other side. It is not what people think it is. It's a very healing event. And many people pass away when they've completed their life mission on Earth and have no further growth potential here, so they move on. And this is absolutely true with the ETs. They are people like us. And in fact, almost all reports, almost without exception, of ETs involve humanoids. People with arms and legs who look perhaps slightly different, but they're more alike, very much like us, than different. And their behavior falls under the same umbrella as human behavior. They're really not that different from us. The variation we have here on Earth is very close to the variation they have. They are people, and they have the same values, the same experiences that we do, except they are more technologically and spiritually advanced. And yes, there's every indication they have an afterlife.
Thank you all for attending. This has been an excellent, excellent program. I really appreciate it, Preston.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, no need to fear UFOs. I'm not going to say it can't be scary or that some people don't have
I'd like
negative
to see
encounters.
one. I'd really like to encounter one.
But I'm telling you, they're not here to hurt us. From my research, I think we have no reason to worry and every reason to be very encouraged. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe.